Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Ellen Wood, and I am pleased to introduce Nick Banich, one of Miebach's partners and Chief Revenue Officer for US and Canada. And today he is going to present information on regionalization and nearshoring. Welcome, Nick.
Hey, thank you, Ellen. Appreciate the opportunity. I think certainly in light of recent U.S. Political results, this probably is even a bit of a hotter topic than when we planned this a couple months ago.
Absolutely. So let's get right into it.
Yeah, so I guess, taking a look at the world and a lot of us were introduced to the book 2005. I actually think I have it behind me on Friedman when he authored the book, The World is Flat, that really talked about globalization 3.0. And the preface to this webinar is to really challenge that now that we're nearly 20 years since that book has been written on, is that still true today? What are some of the things that Friedman kind of anchored his belief on, this new age of globalization that was here to stay? And if that really holds true, given the recent history as well as looking forward to the future. So if we look at this chart from U.S. government, it takes a look at volumes of U.S. imports comparing China and Mexico. As we all know, historically, China has been our largest trade partner. And then with the disruptions of the pandemic and with some of the realities, the geopolitical considerations, in 2003, Mexico surpassed China for that largest spot. And when I first noticed this, and the more discussing with supply chain leaders and some of the executive leadership conferences I'm in, this topic that was originally, hey, it's a pandemic thing, hey, maybe it's a China plus one thing, those talks just kept going where it did feel like more than just a fad. And to really challenge and look at, is this just a milestone moment in time? Or let's dig a bit deeper and what are some of the structural changes, more so than just saying, hey, COVID, what really did change and not just what's going on now, but again, like I said, looking forward to see, are we really in a flat world or has it become round again? So in Friedman's book, he had 10 flatteners. When we look at those, I think there are 8 really root cause things that have happened that really challenge what was laid out 20 years ago. First is resilience, risk mitigation. Became big top of mind when everyone got exposed during the pandemic on just how unresilient supply chains were and just how much risk could get introduced and how disruptive it would be. This is where we've seen, hey, look, single sourced out of China, or hey, I'm multi-sourced, but all of my location sources are from the same country. The pandemic, the logjam at the ports, labor constraints, how different companies open, shut down, reopen coming out of the pandemic really expose that. So what we see is taking a look at supplier diversification, not just am I buying too much volume from one supplier, but what does the overall geographical landscape look like with my supplier base? So how many suppliers do I have? Yes, check that box, but going deeper on the number of countries, the number of regions, the number of ports I utilized, right? We had a near disaster recently with the East Coast ports and the strike that luckily only lasted a couple of days. They still haven't ironed everything out with that trade agreement, specifically around automation at the ports. So that may rear its ugly head once again in the coming months. Realities of proximity to the market, right? Time equals inventory, even inventory equals cash, more inventory, less flexibility. So by sourcing closer into the Americas, let's use Mexico for example, reduction in transit times. Average, again, normalize it out for disruptions at ports, around 30 days ocean from China, give or take a week or two, depending on the boat routing and where you are on the stop and drop off, versus 8-day via ocean from Mexico or 3 days via truck. We've talked about those inventory benefits. All that leads to greater agility. Agility really becomes the friend of everyone in an age of unknown, which I think we're about to enter once again. So it gives you greater freedom in planning. It gives you greater freedom on the level of accuracy you're requiring on your demand forecast and trends. Just allows you to be more reactive or even proactive towards the world as it continues to evolve. Third thing is quality control collaboration. As companies want greater control over their processes, obviously the concerns with IP adherence with the Chinese and other markets. Another big thing, see more and more, yes, we're traveling less for work, but also just similar time zones for ease of fostering alignment, communication between teams. McKinsey did a study back in 2023 where 42% of supply chain leaders not only looked at nearshoring or onshoring activities, but actually took actions leading to that. For some, it may have been merely just a China plus one strategy. For others, it was starting to dual source with suppliers in the Americas, suppliers in the US, the ability to also start investing in capacity and capability in the Americas or back onshore in the United States. So it's not just something companies are looking at. In 2023, again, nearly half of companies, of supply chain leaders that participated in this study were actually taking action and migrating towards some form of nearshoring activity. If we continue to look beyond these first three flatteners, fourth one, and I think this heat is about to increase dramatically, is trade skirmishes. So trade tensions, even in the previous administration or the current administration, in the Biden administration, they did not roll back a lot of the Chinese tariffs that were in place, and those trade tensions continue to rise. Geopolitical, human rights, IP concerns still are at the center of both parties on their narrative with China and how to react, how to deal with China as both a trade partner, but also a partner that doesn't have their interests fully aligned with the United States. You have LPA a couple of years ago passed a new law around the Xinjiang province. This is where the Uyghur population is that has been front and center in a lot of narratives around human rights. It's very different with the policy they placed in that U.S. law, right? There's that presumption of innocent until proven guilty. This actually moves over to guilty until proven innocent, that if you're sourcing anything from the Xinjiang province, it's prohibited unless you can prove that there was no inhumane labor used in the sourcing production of those products. So that moves that burden of proof on innocence to the importer, where they're going to be suspect unless you have the right documentation to prove that. Again, recently, the CHIPS and Science Law that really moved to push semiconductor and chip manufacturing out of just Southeast Asia and build up capacity and capability in the U.S. With the acknowledgement that, hey, we probably do need to be more multi-sourced when it comes to chips for everything from AI to your refrigerator to your automobile. It actually prohibits any subsidiaries of a Chinese parent company to access any of those subsidies for U.S. semiconductor production. Fifth one goes around sustainability. Sustainability continues to take part in the narrative. Again, this is whether you're a US-based company, you're a European-based company. And as we start looking at Tier 3 emissions and other aspects on your ESG scorecard, over 60% of China's electricity today is produced by coal, versus the sustainability gains and benefits that you can claim by sourcing in a place such as Mexico, where 75% of electricity is produced by thermal means, 19% by hydro. Going back to and calling back to those things about transit time, it's not just about agility, it's not just about inventory savings, it's also around the lower emissions, right? Ocean carriage, 30 days versus 8. This is another benefit then on sustainability as you start looking at Tier 3 emissions. that are benefits in that overall business case towards looking at a regionalized sourcing production strategy for your business. The American Chamber of Commerce in China still see that China is going to be a top 3 investment destination. So this isn't a, hey, give up on China, bail from China. However, that means 55% see China outside that top 3, whether it's other places in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and others, or that's moving things into the Americas for that nearshoring. So again, it's not that everyone's giving up on China, but on the other side, a majority see China outside the top 3. Again, another interesting data point on where leaders of large global multinationals are directing their decision-making moving forward. As we get to the next couple of things that I think challenge freedmen, first is labor cost parity. So with China and their desire to raise the income level across that country, that has led to higher labor costs, which is one of their paramount benefits historically. Also, demographic concerns in China. The legacy one-child policy is really putting pressure on the demographic situation in China. I was at a conference about 6 months ago. I believe it was the editor-in-chief of The Economist said that, I believe it's 2025, that the Chinese consumers will buy more adult diapers than baby diapers. So you're dealing with an aging workforce, you're dealing with a decline in labor availability. Those naturally lead to higher wages, on top of the fact that Chinese standard of living has increased quite a bit. So depending on, right, Mexico is a very diverse country. China is a very diverse country. Depending on the region, depending on the specific skill set you're looking at, the per hour wage differential might be as low as $1 to 50 cents an hour. This all of a sudden, when you compound the transportation lead times, the inventory costs, when you compound the length of the supply chain and the challenges to agility, when you compound this with the resiliency considerations, now I think you can start seeing why that graph on the first slide starts to look the way it does. Continuing on this theme of labor, but in a different light, technological advancements. So increasing adoption of automation reduces the amount of labor. So this does have a benefit for China, where that differential is less. However, that also is still a benefit when you're looking at nearshoring, onshoring. So where there still is that delta where Mexico is greater, can you diffuse that a bit through automation and some other things? Look, whatever region that Miebach's operating in, we are seeing an increase in technological adaptation. I think with our continued challenges as demographic, as a global society, with the desire to lower the amount of people in the poverty line. I know there's a saying in a lot of apparel that apparel manufacturing chases poverty. As we continue to advance and raise the standards of the globe, which is a good thing, you're going to continue to see adoption of automation, which if your company's not looking at, you're probably one of the last ones, because affordabilities have been coming down. Lead times for automation have been coming down, coming out of that pandemic spike. There's a lot of activities around this, even in lower cost countries. Again, because dependency on labor, regardless of the hourly rate, is still a topic that's on top of mind. Again, this can also be debated a little bit. We'll see how the incoming administration handles this, but there are still headwinds for pure US-based manufacturing. US also faces demographic issues, certainly not as severe as in China and other countries, but we do have an aging workforce, wages are rising, and there are limited labor pools. These are all things that are causing cost of manufacturing in the US to still be a challenge when you take a look at the hard financials of it. US dollar, it has fluctuated recently, but historically has had a pretty strong run. That does prove beneficial for sourcing outside the country. As long as the dollar remains strong, we'll see what happens again with the upcoming administration, but a strong dollar going to be beneficial to import. In addition to offshore models moving nearshore, we have done some work specifically around some clients and some U.S. industries evaluating the opportunity to move onshore production south. So yes, there's a lot of energy on things coming back into the America, but then it's always that question based on the demographics, based on the labor cost of, am I onshore in the United States, or do I leverage USMCA and some other things and offshore either in Mexico or somewhere else in Latin America? So this one is more not so much saying, hey, Friedman was wrong, but more, this is the reality. There still are some headwinds. We'll talk a little bit about what could happen with the next administration. Those things don't necessarily make it a slam dunk that, hey, any new manufacturing base I need to make absolutely needs to be in the United States. So I say all this, right? There's some tailwinds, there's some headwinds, there's some things that are continue to be beneficial to China, some things that are beneficial for Mexico. It's not a, hey, this is the right decision in all industries for all companies. Biggest question we're getting posed, again, running for the last 3+ years coming out of the pandemic, is the seek for agility and this seeking of this, what is the right mix? So understanding really what is the cost to serve, and not just cost to serve from time it leaves my distribution center to my customer door, but really peeling the onion back and looking at it as a full end-to-end cost to serve, and just understanding those drivers and levers. How sensitive is my sourcing strategy? How sensitive is my manufacturing strategy to energy costs, to labor, to real estate, inventory carrying costs? To really understand the impact those levers have, because the future is not so straightforward. So that way, as changes happen, you understand that sensitivity and you already have an idea of what can we do, right? Hey, look, these 3 levers turn in this direction, it's greater headwinds. I do need to ramp up sourcing in my US and Mexico-based suppliers, turn down my Southeast Asia-based ones. Hey, look, energy costs and what, again, conflict in Eastern Europe, conflict in the Middle East, energy costs are impacted by all of those. Hey, how sensitive am I to that? What do I need to change as far as my manufacturing capacity and capability in relationship to that? Lead time, again, you're going to see a common theme here. It's getting away from just my final node to the customer, but really understanding it all the way through is, what is my true lead time? And based on that, going to the planning teams and discussing, hey, when should our order freeze time be? What should the production wheel look like? And how often should we make ABC SKUs? Certain SKUs that are more dependent on certain suppliers that are higher risk because of geopolitical tensions, and really infusing more analytics, more insights and decisions throughout the planning scheduling wheel. So that way you understand inventory dwell times better, you understand your distribution processing times across that whole value chain. So in this continued trend of de-siloing the supply chain and trying to get more robust, get more analytical in our planning processes, is taking these things and then understanding how should I change my operating model and how I plan. Risk exposure, likelihood of severity to it. This is something that again, we've seen a heavy uptake in our end-to-end or production footprint strategy engagements, where we are doing the pest analysis. We are looking at political, economic, social, and technological risks to really understand, again, I think it was Colin Powell who famously said, no good battle plan survives first contact. yes, we have our 5-year strategy. Yes, we have our 3-year strategy. Yes, we have our 7-year strategy. But where is my exposure, right? So as reality happens, and again, I'm not trying to sit here and prophesize with a crystal ball on what markets and what certain cost factors for the supply chain are going to do the next 4, 8, 12 years. If I was good at that, I would have bought a ton of Bitcoin a couple of weeks ago and wouldn't be sitting here. But just understanding where is the risk exposure and how will we react to it, so you are ahead of the game when the world invariably happens and causes those disruptions. Which leads into that final one on the exposure, what redundancy in place, and do we have an action plan, right? Is there a folder that's at the top of everyone's desk for, hey, if the East Coast ports shut down, then what? There's a couple private ports on the East Coast. Are we able to access them? Do we already have some agreements set up? Can we move material to the West Coast? Can, instead of ocean shipments we're doing from Mexico to the US, can we get those to rail or truck? So having those action plans in place, so that way, inevitably, when the world happens, like I said, you're able to react as quick as possible versus, hey, we need to go figure this out. We lose 3 days, we lose a week, we lose 2 weeks, which is going to result then in 10% cost increase, which is then going to result in stockouts for that month. Again, we're very quick to forget the lessons we learned in the past, and every month that goes on from the things that happened in 20 and 21, we've seen it, right, as inflation increased, as PPI increased, as the need to shore up the quarterly report to the street became larger and larger. As we got away from the pandemic, we did see companies start to shift away from that. Just a heat of warning of, do not forget what's happened in the past. This agility, this resiliency, this risk understanding can provide immense benefit. And one lever that you should be looking at, if you're not already, absolutely is this onshoring, nearshoring, because understanding how that can benefit these 4 bullet points above are going to support questions you're going to get in a multitude of ways in the coming weeks, months, if you haven't been faced with them already. I've alluded to it a little bit, but going a little bit deeper on the recent U.S. election news. Here is my attempt at a crystal ball. So U.S. election results have shown, right, there is going to be a presidency, executive branch, the upper house and the Senate, lower house and the House. It is going to be a unified government under the Trump administration. Based on things that are quickly coming out in the news and in press releases, we're starting to understand what that transition plan is going to look like. Campaigns always have a lot of big promises. What happens now? It's time to do the real work. It does seem that, and I believe primarily because it is going to be such a slim margin in the House of Representatives. For those of you unfamiliar with U.S. politics, typically in a midterm election, the party of the presidency loses seats. It does not look like Republicans will have a huge majority in the House of Representatives, which very much puts the probability on the table that in the 2026 midterms, the House could flip, which then we get to a divided government and gridlock. So what it looks like is the new government, when it's seated in January, will want to act swiftly and decisively, because typically there's a 100-day period. The first 100 days is when, for most administrations in U.S. government, most things happen, because once you get pretty on fast that, all 435 members of the House are going to be looking at their next election in the midterm. So I do think the changes that are going to come, and there will be changes, specifically what, let's see, it is going to get unveiled before we get to summertime. It does seem like the Trump administration is going to want to have a carrot and stick approach. I think biggest reason for this is with the tax cuts they want to do, they need to find a way to offset that. And it does seem like they are trying to explore ways to offset the tax cuts with tariffs. What has been out on the campaign is a 15% corporate tax. I know in the US media, a lot of people have just focused on that. I think the most important thing for supply chain leaders and people that thought something like this would be interesting to take 30 minutes out of your day around is it's only going to be for companies that manufacture in America. How specifically this is going to work, there's nothing really out there yet. It may look similar to around 2007, I think to 14, there was a Section 199 deduction that could be taken for what was produced in America. I think this is the lever they're going to do it. Again, don't quote me on that. But there is a move to try to, hey, make in America, do that with a carrot by lowering the corporate tax rate. The stick to either push companies to do that, but also to help fund this reduction in tax rates and other tax cuts the administration is talking about is they're talking about a 20% tariff on all imports. So this would include Mexico. Potentially, again, has to see how this plays with US, the new NAFTA, USMCA. 20% tariff on all imports. Again, we'll have to see what that does with the neighbors to the north in Canada and south in Mexico and how that plays with the trade agreements that are in place, but ramping that up to 60% from China. While those specifics are limited, I think you can dovetail this back and look at why it's important to understand those levers, right? If there is a cross-border tax with whether it's Mexico or just the rest of Latin America, whether Canada's included or not, if all the Americas are exempt from it, because there's always exemptions and loopholes to these things, you already can start understanding those cost levers. You don't need to wait until everything gets passed to start doing that due diligence now, right? 60% from China, you should be able to do that due diligence now. How is that going to impact your landed cost, your total cost to serve to your customers? The winners of this are going to be those who have done several scenario plans, have started to understand their levers and sensitivity from a price standpoint to react whatever those specifics are going to be. The other winners will be the lobbyists. They're already getting ramped up to negotiate these big changes to US tax policy, but the corporations, the supply chain leaders that are already doing their homework now in the run-up for what will be changes, I think are going to be the ones that really benefit from this. Now, if we start talking about, okay, how do I start doing this? If you are still using Microsoft Excel to look at all these different scenarios and take a look at the different products and what the BOM is and where these items of the BOM are sourced, good on you, I guess. There's easier ways to solve this puzzle. On the market, there are a number of supply chain design tools. For those of you that have not been paying attention, the supply chain design world and software world, the tool providers that provide the platform to do these sort of analytics have been going through a bit of a revolution in that market, which I think benefits all users of it, to where all providers are investing heavily to recapture market share in what's become a very fragmented market, which is good, especially given all this. But leveraging supply chain design tools, leveraging a platform, having a process on how to do this sort of analytics, because these platforms with the right process, with the right expertise, you can take a look at your total landed costs, all the way from tier X, to your customer's doorstep or your store's doors. Sourcing optimization can be done through it. Line level manufacturing optimization. So you can say, hey, if we move this line and this capability from Southeast China to the US or Mexico, what does that look like? They can help with mode analysis, port of entry selection. Most people think of supply chain design tools for that bottom bullet point around distribution optimization. Yes, those tools are great at that, but they can do so much more. And given what's in front of all of us, I think if you already have access to these tools and you're not doing it, you're already paying for the capability, depending on your provider and how that contract is set up. Why aren't you leveraging it? If it's a question of expertise or having the right models, that can be solved. yes, I'll plug Miebach and that we can support that, but it can be solved and to leverage the tool you already have. If you don't have these platforms, this is where I would urge you and can give you a list of names of providers to look at, if you're interested. But it's not that you necessarily have to buy the platform and build this capability from the ground up and get all that decided before the government hits its 100th day in office. There's ways to onboard to that, to get some help and to build this capability, over the long term. Now, just because the tool can do all of this analytics, we urge customers and our clients to not just build one model and solve the world in it, and to really have a modeling strategy, have really a library of models, have your end-to-end model on a more strategic level, okay? Certain questions I want to ask, answer with that model, have a detailed sourcing, have a detailed manufacturing at a line level, and even looking at processing versus packaging and maybe secondary packaging. You can break each of those down from capacity, capability, and model that. Have a modeling, have an inventory model, have a transport model that are more detailed than a more strategic model. So that way you can ask the right questions and get very detailed in your analytics. So you can take the results of those models and go to your planning teams and talk about what it means. Go to the manufacturing teams, talk about what it means. Go to the scheduling teams, go to the transportation department, and have very rich data-driven discussions. We as a firm believe data is the new gold. These tools allow you to get predictive, prescriptive, to test and play a little bit of crystal ball, play with the what ifs, and then again, start working on what those action plans are so you can get ahead of the curve for the change that is coming. So with that, I think I covered the main things I wanted to cover on here, but certainly open it up to questions in the Q&A. May not be able to get to all of them, don't know how many there are, but want to open it up to questions. Feel free to play Stump the Chump.
So we do have a couple questions in the Q&A. Most of them are in regards to the labor and automation points that you made in terms of, the disparity between Mexico specifically and China, and the aging population you got into a little bit, but also that tribal knowledge that exists in China because of that longevity of the production that has been there being lost, and Mexico not having that depth of understanding. Can you talk to that a little bit more?
Yeah, and that's always the risk whenever you outsource anything is, yes, people look at it from a financial standpoint. But the knowledge loss and the risk of that is always the greatest thing. It's once you lose it, it's hard to get it back. I guess the common idiom, if you don't use it, you lose it. So once that knowledge base leaves, what happens? There is a lot of investment that's going on in Mexico by Chinese companies. They also see the reality of this. And while it is a concern, yes, there is a lot of work being put in to try to diffuse that. It comes down to cost benefit analysis. I think as we continue to have this world that gets more fractured and regionalized again, it is only a matter of time before it comes back. Now, do you want to be the guinea pig? No. So yes, there is a knowledge loss there, but I think not just Mexico, but a lot of Latin American countries will see this opportunity and try to do things, whether it's via their immigration rules to try to, entice people that have certain knowledge bases to come in, to invest in education around these areas. Again, we live in a world that's largely driven by economic interests. It's a concern, but I think as time goes on, it'll get mitigated via either just investments in education and immigration policy to potentially bring in knowledge base in specific industries and skill sets based on what Latin American countries want to do. But yeah, it's definitely part of that risk analysis that needs to be done to understand what's your exposure to it, and come up with a plan to mitigate it.
And in regard to the automation point, you mentioned that Miebach sees automation increasing across all geographies, across all industries. It's just the trend. So that being the case, how does nearshoring take advantage of that in a way that is essentially the one up over the Chinese geography?
It's going to diffuse that labor differential. It still exists, right? It's lower again for some regions and some industries, but there still is a labor differential there. Historically, a lot of things with the Southeast Asia that were high volume, low mix, there wasn't a ton of complexity there in the actual manufacturing process. A lot of the higher mix, lower volume stuff is what stayed in the United States, is what stayed nearshored. With automation, again, as everyone's labor rates are rising, right? The differential is what's closing between regions. There still is going to be the introduction for automation into these areas. When you're looking at even things that haven't been automated yet in the distribution environment, right? There are several startups that believe, and we're working with some clients on this, they have cracked the code for automated trailer and truck, whether it's unpalletized or palletized, load and unload. There's several organizations, startups that believe they have cracked the autonomous yard vehicle. So if you're not having an automation strategy, if you're not looking at automation as your friend, again, over time, we expect labor costs to continue to increase with the shrinking labor pool. Right, I forget the year, but eventually the world population is going to decline. It's not for a while out, but a lot of that growth is driven by Africa and some other regions, not necessarily the westernized world. Labor is going to continue to get scarce, and then it becomes a question of the employees, the associates you have, what do you want them doing? Is it doing horizontal pallet moves? Not the greatest value add. Right? So if you have a limited labor pool, why don't you want them focused on things like complex customization? Why don't you want them focused on and upskill people for doing preventative maintenance for the processing equipment? So that way, again, as that labor pool shrinks, you're able to be competitive there. So long-winded answer to just say, even in lower cost countries, even for things that historically haven't been able to be automated, if you haven't looked at it in a while, it probably would behoove you to do a little due diligence there to see what could make sense.
All right, I think that wraps up all of our questions from the Q&A. Where can people reach out to you in order to have a further discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn, and everybody is, but my email address is Banich, BANICH, at Miebach.com. Be happy to dive deeper on any specific questions you may have, something that isn't a direct question to this, but you just want 2 cents on, always happy to facilitate a conversation and compare notes. If you think I'm deadly wrong on something, also let me know. I don't claim to know everything and all things, so happy to have a discussion if you're feeling or seeing something different in your specific area of expertise.
All right, thank you so much to our audience, to Nick, and that's all for today.
Have a good one. Thanks.